33 years ago, in the city of Boston, a 6-year-old girl vanished in the blink of an eye in broad daylight, leaving no clear trace, devastating her family and plunging them into despair. Authorities suspected foul play, launching a large-scale investigation, but with no body found, no key witnesses, and too few leads to pursue, the case eventually stalled. Yet throughout all those years, the girl's family never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that their daughter might still be alive somewhere. Then one day, decades later, from old dusty files and a seemingly insignificant detail overlooked for far too long, the truth began to emerge in a way that completely transformed the case and left everyone involved stunned. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Where working-class neighborhoods still operated at a slow pace, neighbors knew each other by face, children could play in the streets without constant adult supervision, and the concept of stranger danger barely existed in the community's consciousness. In South Boston, rows of attached houses, small shops, churches, seaside parks, and familiar routes created a space where adults believed everything was under control. The Cooper family lived in a small but tidy home in this working-class area, a typical lower-middle-class family of the era. The father worked long hours with a steady income. The mother juggled part-time work and homemaking. Life wasn't affluent, but it was orderly, without conflicts, scandals, or any reason to draw attention. In that family structure, Lily Cooper was the youngest child, 6 years old, at the age when kids start getting small amounts of freedom like playing near home alone, walking short familiar distances, or staying within sight of adults, without direct minute-by-minute supervision. Lily had a petite build, an unremarkable appearance among peers her age, gentle personality, obedient and rarely defiant toward adults, a child raised to be polite and trusting of those around her, especially anyone who seemed kind, a common approach to child-rearing back then. Lily's level of independence matched the societal norms of the time, enough to be allowed to play in familiar areas alone, but still completely reliant on the perceived safety of her surroundings, an environment that both the Cooper family and the community believed posed no real threat. The day of the incident started like any other, with no warning signs, no obvious unusual events, daily routines unfolding as usual, until a small but strange element appeared, enough to tip the mains of control without anyone noticing right away. It wasn't violent, it wasn't an attention-grabbing act, but a subtle intervention that occurred in a context that seemed completely reasonable, where the presence of a stranger wasn't seen as dangerous, and any fleeting vigilance was quickly replaced by self-reassurance based on prevailing social belief. It was precisely the combination of that trust and Lily's obedient nature that created a brief but fatal window, when control shifted without any loud noise or resistance, strong enough to alert those near. Only when Lily was no longer where she was supposed to be did the normalcy begin to crack, first with a vague unease, then growing anxiety as time passed without a reasonable explanation. The Cooper family reacted instinctively, without waiting or planning, immediately searching familiar areas, asking neighbors, calling Lily's name at her usual spots, repeating actions that had never been necessary before. The spontaneous search quickly spread through the small community, but the more they looked, the clearer and more terrifying Lily's absence became, as there were no signs she'd returned on her own, or was near. When initial efforts yielded nothing, unease turned to panic, and the family had to confront a possibility they'd never considered in a city they believed was safe. The decision to call the police was made in a state of emergency, marking the moment when an ordinary day in Boston in 1966 officially ended, giving way to a disappearance that no one in the Cooper family, or the surrounding community, could have imagined the duration and consequences. The missing person report from the Cooper family was received at the local Boston police station in a context where this wasn't yet seen as a rare situation from the perspective of law enforcement in 1966, when cases of children wandering off, being late home, or temporarily out of contact were frequently recorded, and most ended without serious consequences. Initial information was documented according to standard procedures, focusing on the victim's identity, age, residence, last seen time, and the person directly responsible for supervision, all handled more administratively than urgently, reflecting the prevailing investigative mindset at the time that a 6-year-old in a familiar neighborhood was highly likely just playing past curfew or nearby. Case classification was based on the era's existing criteria, where signs of abduction weren't clear enough to trigger a full emergency response, especially without evidence of violence, direct witnesses to coercion, or any ransom demands or unusual contacts recorded. On that basis, the case was initially categorized as a missing child without clear criminal indicators, meaning priority in the first hours didn't reach the highest level, though formally a file was still opened and recorded as an official case. Alongside receiving the information, on-duty officers conducted a preliminary narrowing of the disappearance timeframe. Based on the family's account and known daily routines of Lily, identifying a relatively narrow window during the day when loss of control occurred, while also scoping the area around the residence and routes or public spaces a child that age could naturally access. These details were compiled into an initial summary, sufficient to form a basic investigative framework, but not enough to conclude any hypothesis about the case's nature. The case file was created using the standard template, numbered and stored in the police department's paper system, with a lead investigator assigned along with a small support team tasked with gathering information, canvassing the area, and maintaining contact with the family. This assignment reflected how police forces operated then, with limited resources and cases not deemed serious often handled by a small team alongside other duties. Immediately after the file was opened, investigators approached the initial scene, the area where Lily was last seen and surroundings, with the goal of verifying provided information, observing real conditions, and looking for any signs missed during the family's and neighbors' earlier spontaneous search. This approach was more verification than tracing, focusing on understanding the victim's living environment, assessing Lily's familiarity with the area, paths, alleys and spots a child could easily reach, thereby clarifying the likelihood of her leaving the controlled area on her own versus external intervention. During this, police noted the scene had been significantly disturbed by prior spontaneous searching, making preservation of physical evidence nearly impossible, a common reality in disappearances then, but critically impacting later evidence collection potential. Simultaneous, initial contact with the Cooper family was conducted to gather additional information and provide reassurance, but also with a checking element, to determine if any internal family factors might be involved in Lily's disappearance, reflecting a common investigative trend of the era prioritizing close relations before expanding outward. The entire process of receiving the report and activating the investigation occurred in a short but sufficient time to establish formal handling framework for the case, while inadvertently setting initial limits on how the case was perceived, classified and prioritized, limits that would directly influence the pace and direction of subsequent steps in searching for Lily Cooper. Immediately after the initial scene approach was complete, the focus of handling the case shifted to reconstructing what happened in the short but decisive period before Lily Cooper vanished, as without signs of violence or clear physical evidence, the timeline and last known location became the most critical foundation for shaping subsequent hypotheses. Investigators started by precisely determining the last sighting point of Lily, based on statements from relatives and those present in the area at the time, cross-referencing descriptions to pinpoint a relatively specific location in her familiar living space, where Lily's presence was seen as completely normal and unremarkable. Determining this point held not just geographical meaning, but also clarified the scope of control the family and community believed they had over the child, raising the core question of how that control was broken without immediate notice. Based on the confirmed last location, investigators reconstructed the day's timeline chronologically, starting from Lily's morning routine activities, times she was seen, interactions with others, up to when her absence was first noticed. This timeline was built from multiple sources, including family accounts, neighbors and passers-by, though each was subjective and affected by imperfect memory, but together they formed a relatively coherent sequence. In the process, investigators paid special attention to inconsistent or uncertain time points, as those hazy overlaps often held higher potential for external intervention. From the preliminary timeline, a key gap emerged: The short period between the last sighting of Lily and when relatives or witnesses returned to look and found her gone, a gap long enough for something serious to occur but too short for immediate panic. This gap became the analysis focal point, posing two main possibilities. Either Lily left the familiar area on her own in a very short time, or an external factor influenced her to leave unusually. To assess the self-wandering possibility, investigators thoroughly examined Lily's personal characteristics, including age, independence level, area familiarity and safe routes she could take alone, while comparing to environmental conditions like traffic density and natural or man-made obstacles affecting a 6-year-old's movement. This evaluation aimed to determine if Lily could have voluntarily left the familiar zone without adult help, and if so, which direction in that brief time. However, comparing these factors to the reconstructed timeline revealed unconvincing aspects in the self-wandering theory, as the short duration and reasonable movement range for her age couldn't explain complete disappearance without traces or sightings elsewhere. In parallel, the external influence possibility was weighed based on an unusual element appearing before loss of control and the silent, unnoticeable manner of disappearance without struggle or panic sign. Investigators analyzed the scenario of an adult or third party approaching Lily in a reasonable context, exploiting prevalent societal trust in her obedient nature to lead her away without force, a scenario fitting the lack of direct witnesses to clear suspicious behavior. Evaluating these possibilities wasn't to reach a final conclusion then, but to set investigative priorities while identifying initial assumptions that could lead to errors if not carefully considered. As the timeline was refined with added or adjusted details, investigators were aware the scene had been heavily disturbed by prior spontaneous searching, making physical evidence reliance nearly impossible, thus increasing the importance of analyzing time sequence and human behavior. The entire scene and timeline reconstruction process occurred amid a lack of modern investigative tools, forcing police to rely heavily on logical deduction and field experience, while accepting that story gaps might never be fully filled. Nonetheless, confirming Lily's last sighting point, building a relatively consistent timeline, and isolating the key gap helped clarify the case's nature, shifting focus from an inexplicable absence to a specific investigative puzzle about what happened in the brief minutes when control over Lily Cooper was lost. From the reconstructed timeline and the key gaps that had just been identified, the handling of the case moved into a systematic phase of collecting statements aimed at uncovering any fragment of information that could clarify what had happened during the time Lily Cooper went missing, starting with immediate family members and gradually expanding to witnesses who had been near the scene. Investigators worked directly with Lily's parents, recording the entire sequence of events on the day of the incident in greater detail than the initial missing person report, focusing on minor changes in routine, unusual interactions, moments when Lily was out of sight, and the adults' reactions at each specific point. These statements were gathered amid high levels of stress and emotion, resulting in information that was rich in emotional content but not always consistent in details, requiring investigators to continually cross-reference and ask follow-up questions to resolve ambiguity. In parallel with the family, police approached neighbors living nearby, people who frequently passed through the area where Lily played, and anyone considered likely to have seen her during the critical time frame, from vendors and passers-by to other caregivers in the vicinity. Every statement was recorded, even if it involved only very minor or uncertain observations, because in a case lacking physical evidence, any detail could prove significant if placed correctly within the overall picture. As the number of statements grew, investigators began categorizing them by reliability based on multiple factors, such as the witness's location at the time of observation, their familiarity with Lily, ability to pinpoint exact timing, and consistency across different retelling. Some statements were rated highly valuable because they came from people familiar with Lily's appearance and who regularly observed the area, while others were relegated to reference only due to their vagueness or lack of verifiable basis. This categorization process highlighted a common reality in urban missing person cases with high population density. Many people may have seen something, but very few recognize the importance of what they saw at the time, causing memories to fade or alter over time. Among the statements examined more closely, there were scattered descriptions of an unusual element appearing before Lily vanished, such as the presence of a stranger or a situation that did not fully align with normal daily activity. But these descriptions did not fully match in terms of appearance, age, or behavior, making it difficult to synthesize them into a clear composite image. Some witnesses recalled an adult walking with a child around Lily's age, but were unsure if it was her, while others only remembered a feeling that something was off without being able to specify what. Investigators noted these descriptions as potential anomalies, while cautiously avoiding assigning them more meaning than the data allowed, as premature speculation could lead to misdirected investigation. When all the statements were compiled and analyzed, a common thread emerged. No witness could provide information specific enough to identify a clear suspect. There were no detailed descriptions of coercive behavior, no evidence suggesting Lily had been forced or resisted, and no information strong enough to connect the scattered anomalies into a deliberate sequence of action. This kept the case in a gray area between the hypothesis of wandering off and the possibility of external involvement, even though prior analyses had revealed weaknesses in the idea that Lily left on her own. The initial data, when placed side by side, presented a fragmented picture with many mismatched pieces, where each statement seemed to exist independently without forming a unified narrative of events. This lack of connection stemmed not only from differences in witnesses' memories, but also from the disturbed scene, the time elapsed before police arrived, and the limitations of data collection methods at that era. Investigators were forced to work with a volume of information that was both overwhelming in quantity and deficient in quality, requiring careful judgment to avoid overlooking key details while not getting bogged down in unfounded assumptions. The failure to identify a specific suspect at this stage did not mean ruling out criminal activity, but reflected the reality that the initial data was not yet strong enough to shape a clear investigative direction, leaving law enforcement in a position of continuing to expand information gathering while maintaining parallel hypotheses. The entire process of witness collection and initial data gathering, though not yielding direct answers, helped clarify the limitations of available information, identify weaknesses in the event picture, and underscore the need for alternative data sources or approaches to get closer to understanding what happened to Lily Cooper in that brief but decisive period. When the initial data proved insufficient to point to a clear direction and suspect identification had achieved no concrete progress, authorities shifted focus to launching an official search with a broader scope, viewing it as a necessary step to test existing hypotheses and rule out the possibility that Lily Cooper was still somewhere in her familiar surroundings. The search was first implemented systematically in the residential area where the Cooper family lived, dividing the territory into specific zones to thoroughly check every street, alley, backyard, shed, basement, and spaces previously examined only spontaneously and disorganized. Participating forces included local police, along with community volunteers, familiar with the terrain and willing to assist, forming a dense search network to ensure no potentially relevant location was missed. Concurrently with the residential sweep, investigators expanded checks to transportation hubs and public spaces a 6-year-old child could reach or be taken to in a short time, including bus stops, train stations, parks, parking lots, and crowded areas where a child accompanied by an adult would not draw attention. These locations were examined based on the assumption that if Lily had wandered off or been led away without force, she might have moved along familiar routes or to public places frequently visited by the community, thus requiring coverage beyond the immediate residential area. During the expanded search, police coordinated with other local entities, such as transit workers, station managers, and public space overseers, to gather reports of any cases resembling Lily's in the relevant time frame, while requesting assistance in observing and reporting unusual signs. This coordination reflected efforts to maximize available resources in an era lacking modern alert systems and interagency information sharing, making communication reliant on direct contact and manual report. Additionally, the local community was mobilized for more organized participation than in the initial phase, with volunteer groups assigned specific areas, times, and tasks to avoid duplication and improve efficiency. Community involvement not only expanded manpower, but also created positive social pressure, turning the case into a shared concern rather than just the Cooper family's issue. Search notices were widely distributed in the area, with Lily's information shared so anyone might recognize and report her, in hopes that collective attention would uncover a clue missed by prior steps. However, despite the expanded spatial and participatory scope, results remained inconclusive, as no reports were specific enough to confirm Lily's presence in any checked location. Incoming information was mostly speculative or unverifiable, such as sightings of similarly aged children without firm confirmation, forcing investigators to continually sort and discard to avoid diluting resources. The lack of direct results in the official search phase posed a major challenge, simultaneously weakening the wandering off hypothesis while not providing sufficient basis to affirm an alternative scenario with high certainty. This impasse compelled investigators to reassess scope and methods, considering that Lily might have left the initial area faster and farther than assumed, or that purely physical searching might be inadequate for the case's nature. Meanwhile, the community continued participating with slim hope that collective effort would yield results, but each passing day without verified information increasingly highlighted the troubling reality that Lily Cooper was no longer within reach of direct search activity, and the case was shifting from an urgent recovery to a far more complex investigation than initially anticipated. Amid expanded searches yielding no direct results and physical sweeps becoming broader, yet less effective, the case handling underwent a significant change when the first physical evidence directly linked to Lily Cooper was discovered, marking a pivotal turning point in how the case was perceived and evaluated. The discovery of the victim's personal items did not occur dramatically or in one spot, but resulted from prolonged, meticulous re-examination of previously checked areas, now scrutinized with a stricter investigative lens, where every minor detail was assessed for potential criminal relevance. These items, though not immediately decisive, held great value as the first tangible traces confirming Lily had been at a specific location after her last sighting, while providing a new reference point for reconstructing events. As investigators analyzed the discovery sites, they considered not only geographic distance from the disappearance point, but also surrounding context, including a 6-year-old's familiarity with the area, outsider access ease, and likelihood of an item being left accidentally or intentionally. Item conditions were closely examined, from integrity and wear signs to placement or drop manner, as each could reflect Lily's or another's behavior at the time. These analyses gradually revealed inconsistencies with the random wandering scenario, as item locations and states did not align with how a child typically loses or leaves belongings while playing near home. Alongside individual item evaluation, investigators integrated them into the pre-established timeline, cross-referencing time, space, and related statements to determine if self-wandering remained plausible. Through this, the hypothesis of Lily leaving familiar surroundings independently exposed increasing weaknesses, as no logical action sequence adequately explained her reaching the evidence sites unseen, despite thorough prior sweeps of likely. Gradually ruling out wandering did not stem from a single decision, but overlapping assessments, each new factor reducing the initial hypothesis' persuasiveness. As investigators concluded Lily was unlikely to have left without intervention, the case focus shifted to abduction, a graver approach requiring comprehensive strategy adjustment. This shift was not merely theoretical but involved re-examining all collected data through a new lens, from witness statements and noted anomalies to the quiet unnoticed disappearance manner. The abduction hypothesis suggested a third party actively approached Lily in a plausible context, exploiting prevalent social trust and her compliant nature to lead her away without force, consistent with no recorded resistance or panic. Accepting this compelled investigators to adapt strategy, moving from seeking a lost child to tracing intentional acts, despite limited tools and methods then available. The new strategy emphasized rescreening individuals with potential critical time access to Lily, especially non-close acquaintances present reasonably in the area, while re-evaluating prior statements for overlooked details when wandering dominated. Physical evidence, though scant, became crucial for reorienting the case, providing a concrete anchor to escape pure speculation. However, the assessment shift introduced new challenges, as without direct witnesses or clear forensic traces, the more plausible abduction hypothesis still lacked strong evidence for swift perpetrator identification. Investigators balanced broadening scope for more possibilities against focusing resources on strongest leads, amid mounting pressure from family and community as hopes of finding Lily alive waned. This strategic adjustment reflected a key transition in case approach, from an inexplicable absence to one showing criminal signs, though undefined in form and motive. The entire process underscored physical evidence' critical role, not as isolated traces, but as catalyst forcing investigators to confront initial assumptions and adapt when new facts no longer fit old explanations. Though shifting to abduction did not immediately resolve Lily Cooper's fate, it placed the case on a different trajectory, where subsequent steps were shaped by recognizing her disappearance as no random accident, but the result of a deliberate act. In the brief moments adult oversight was lost. After the abduction hypothesis was established as the primary approach, and the investigation strategy was adjusted accordingly, the police force began focusing on identifying individuals who might be connected to Lily Cooper's disappearance, starting with those who had appeared or could have accessed the area during the key time frame that had been narrowed down. The initial list included strangers mentioned in previous scattered statements, individuals not part of the known community, but who had a legitimate reason to be in the area, as well as some local residents with a history of unusual behavior, or who had drawn attention in the past, all of whom were considered without clear distinctions in the level of suspicion. Investigators conducted basic background checks on these individuals using the means available at the time, primarily relying on paper records, locally stored information, and limited coordination between units, to determine criminal histories, social connections and their mobility during the period when Lily disappeared. This checking also included reviewing indirect connections, such as family relationships, employment or routine activities, that could facilitate access to children without raising suspicion. However, the level of detail in the data obtained was often insufficient to build a complete suspect profile. In the context of lacking centralized databases and modern federal lookup tools, connecting information between individuals and events became fragmented, causing many potential links to go undetected or unable to be convincingly verified. Additionally, legal tool limitations played a significant role in slowing the investigation process, as at that time tracking, surveilling or deeply interrogating suspicious individuals required specific grounds that the case could not yet provide, resulting in many potential suspects being contacted only superficially before being removed from the list due to lack of direct evidence. Those brief checks, informal conversations, and the inability to apply in-depth investigative measures meant that many leads remained at the level of suspicion without developing into clear investigative direction. At the same time, investigators faced pressure in allocating resources, as the Lily Cooper case had to compete with numerous other incidents, amid limited manpower, making it impractical to pursue every suspect thoroughly without a breakthrough. As a result, some initial leads, though noteworthy when viewed in the context of the abduction hypothesis, were not fully explored and were set aside when corroborating factors did not quickly emerge to strengthen the suspicion. These errors did not necessarily stem from negligence or lack of responsibility, but reflected the operational methods of the investigative system at that time, where decisions were often based on short-term certainty rather than the long-term potential of an investigative direction. As potential suspects were successively eliminated, or fell into a state where further pursuit was impossible due to lack of data and supporting tools, the investigation process began to stall noticeably, with few new leads emerging and approaches gradually circling back to previously considered hypotheses. This stagnation was evident in investigative activities becoming repetitive, focusing more on re-examining old information rather than opening new paths, while expectations of finding breakthrough evidence diminished over time. This situation created a vicious cycle where the lack of results weakened the motivation to pursue thin leads, and the failure to follow through made the chance of achieving results increasingly remote, placing the case in a fragile state between continuing active investigation and the risk of gradually being deprioritized. In that context, systemic investigative errors, from the lack of interagency data, legal restrictions, to the short-term criteria for evaluating leads, contributed to shaping a phase where, even though the abduction hypothesis had been accepted, the case still made no significant progress in identifying the person responsible for Lily Cooper's disappearance. As the investigation process fell into prolonged stagnation due to the absence of new leads and no viable suspects left to pursue, authorities were forced to adjust resource allocation. leading to a gradual reduction in the scale of searches and the level of focus dedicated to the Lily Cooper case over time. Direct search operations, which required significant manpower and costs, began to be scaled back, first by reducing the frequency of field sweeps, then by completely halting large-scale search campaigns in residential areas and public spaces that had been checked multiple times without results. This scaling down did not occur in a single decision but was the consequence of successive assessments showing that the likelihood of finding Lily through traditional search methods was increasingly low, especially without new information to redirect the scope or approach. Alongside the reduction in search activities, the personnel handling the case also began to change, as some initial investigators were reassigned to other duties, retired, or internally redeployed, disrupting continuity in monitoring the case. The change in investigators meant that field knowledge, case handling experience, and accumulated intuitive assessments from the early phase were not always fully passed on to successors, resulting in the case file becoming the primary source of information rather than a deep understanding of the context and developments. In that context, the Lily Cooper case file was systematized and archived for long-term storage according to standard procedures including all reports, statements, physical evidence, and investigative notes collected, with the aim of preserving information for potential future review, though at that time such a possibility was considered very low. The archiving of the file marked an important administrative shift, as the case was no longer treated as an ongoing situation but classified among unsolved incidents, without grounds for continued active investigation under current conditions. Along with this process, the case gradually lost its priority status on the police force's workload list, falling behind newly arising incidents that were more urgent or had clearer evidence, reflecting the operational reality of the justice system and constantly balancing limited resources against an increasing workload. This loss of priority was evident not only in reduced resources, but also in decreased frequency of file reviews, where subsequent re-examinations were mostly formal and not accompanied by new methods or data capable of changing the situation. Over time, the Lily Cooper case was officially labeled a cold case, a term reflecting the frozen state of the investigative progress rather than a conclusion about the nature of the incident, indicating that though unsolved, it was no longer within the scope of active handling by authority. Classifying the case as a cold case meant it was retained as an unresolved file, existing in the system with the slim hope that someday a new lead, an unexpected witness, or an advancement in investigative methods might provide an opportunity to reopen it. However, at the time of transitioning to this status, all practical factors indicated that the case had reached the limits of what could be done with the available resources, tools, and information, making Lily Cooper one of the names recorded on the list of missing children who have not been found, and her disappearance from then on no longer an ongoing pursuit, but an open question lying dormant in the investigative agency's archive. As the Lily Cooper file was placed in long-term storage and no longer handled as an active case, her life and reality continued elsewhere under a different name and in a context completely detached from her past in Boston, for in the years following her disappearance, Lily was raised in a rural area of New Hampshire, where the slow pace of life and the close-knit community meant the appearance of a new child did not raise much suspicion. Under the new identity, she grew up appearing as a normal child in the eyes of those around her, attending local schools, living in an outwardly stable family environment, and showing no obvious signs of anything unusual, at least in ways the community could detect. Notably, this process was not accompanied by any recorded legal adoption records in the state's administrative system, no court decisions, no standard guardianship transfer procedures, and no paper trail indicating Lily had ever been registered as an official adoption case. The absence of such records did not immediately draw attention, as in the context of decades earlier, civil data management was fragmented and lacked interconnectivity, especially in rural areas where administrative procedures were sometimes handled flexibly, or based on trust between involved parties. Lily's new living environment lasted for many years, from childhood through to adulthood, creating a seamless life trajectory, but entirely separate from her original identity, to the extent that even Lily herself had no reason to question her origin. She was taught to believe that the name she carried was her real one, that the people raising her were her only family, and that there was no other past to question, a state of awareness maintained consistently over time. In that environment, Lily had no clear memories of her early years in Boston. If any existed, they were only vague sensory fragments, not specific enough to form a story or meaningful doubt, and any such fragments, if they surfaced, were not encouraged to be explored or named. Not knowing her true identity was not the result of an active decision on Lily's part, but a natural consequence of growing up in a closed information system, where all questions about origins were answered before being asked, or simply not deemed necessary. For many years, Lily lived in a reality where her Boston past did not exist, was not mentioned, left no trace in daily life, from personal documents and school records to social relationships, all revolving around the new identity she had been given. This separation was further reinforced by the complete lack of any connections to the community where Lily was born. No visits, no contact, no memories triggered by familiar people or places, causing the past to become a complete blank in her personal history. The absence of ties to the past was not just passive, but a condition for Lily to fully integrate into her new environment, as any connection to the old identity, if it existed, could expose contradictions that she herself lacked the tools or reason to explain. Throughout this period, Lily's life proceeded along a normal path, with familiar milestones, like education, social relationships, and gradual maturation over the years, not markedly different from her peers, at least on the surface. However, that normality was built on a foundation lacking original information, where facts about personal origins were not transparently established, but the absence was not clear enough to create immediate conflict. From Lily's perspective during this phase, life was a continuous series of experiences, interrupted by questions of identity, as all elements needed to form her sense of self were fully provided in the new environment, from family and school. Not knowing her true identity was not felt as a loss, because Lily had no frame of reference for comparison, and thus no sense that she was missing something important. In that context, the Boston past existed parallel to Lily's life, but completely detached, like a closed file in the investigative system, no longer interacting with her reality in any way. This parallelism reflected a core paradox of the case, where the same person existed in two different timelines, one frozen in an unresolved state, and the other continuing to develop without carrying traces of the initial rupture. During the years living in New Hampshire, Lily had no motive or circumstance forcing her to trace back her origins, as all practical needs were met within the framework of her new identity, and questioning the past offered no clear benefit in daily life. This made the disconnection from the past a stable state, maintained over time without needing active intervention or concealment, until external factors, not yet present in this phase, might disrupt that balance. Within the scope of this part, Lily's life under a different identity was shaped by continuity and outward normality, a life unconnected to the disappearance story that once alarmed an entire community, and also not directly affected by the case being classified as a cold case, as the two realities existed in parallel without intersecting, at least up to this point. Throughout the years, Lily grew up in New Hampshire under her new identity. Her daily life proceeded in a relatively stable manner, but alongside that outward normality was the quiet existence of unusual signs related to personal documents and civil records. Minor details that at the time were not sufficient to raise clear suspicions, but later took on particularly significant meaning. From the very first administrative procedures associated with starting school, the documents related to Lily showed a certain lack of consistency, manifested in the way information was recorded inconsistently across forms. Some documents used handwritten data, others relied on uncertified copies, and there was no unified foundational file for cross-referencing. These differences were not considered serious in the context of administrative management in small communities, where completing records was sometimes formalistic and relied more on trust between families and schools than on strict verification processes. Among those inconsistencies, Lily's date of birth and place of birth were two elements that frequently showed contradictions, with some documents recording information different from what was used in others, creating a chain of data that did not fully match. but was not clear enough to force any individual or organization to probe deeper. These contradictions were often explained by common administrative reasons, such as recording errors, copying mistakes, or differences between initial sources of information. And since they caused no direct consequences in daily life, they were gradually overlooked as minor insignificant errors. Gaps in Lily's civil records also existed alongside those contradictions, evident in the absence of foundational documents considered standard for a child born and raised in the United States, such as a fully authenticated original birth certificate or legal guardianship transfer records. However, in the context of decades earlier, when storage systems were not yet digitized and data exchange between states was limited, these gaps did not automatically trigger cross-verification processes, especially when no other factors indicated that Lily was at risk or showed signs of harm. The organizations that interacted with Lily during her upbringing, from schools to local agencies, all handled her information based on what was directly provided, and since that information was sufficient to meet minimum administrative requirements, it was not scrutinized further regarding its origins. This created a self-reinforcing loop in which inconsistencies existed but went undetected, as no system required comprehensive cross-referencing of data with a central source. For Lily herself, these anomalies were not perceived as a problem, since she had no point of comparison and no access to the full picture of her personal documents, as all procedures were handled by the adults around her. The occasions when she had to fill in personal information or sign forms occurred as a normal part of life, and any differences in how the information was presented were accepted as obvious, without suggesting that something was fundamentally wrong. Over time, these unusual signs became a fixed but invisible part of Lily's life records, existing in filing cabinets and disparate storage systems without being connected to form an overall picture. The fact that these signs were overlooked for so long did not stem from a clear intentional act of concealment during this period, but was a consequence of how administrative systems operated, where each agency was responsible for only a small portion of the data, and rarely had reason to review an individual's entire personal history without a specific request. The normalization of minor discrepancies caused them to gradually lose their warning nature, and each time they were processed or repeated in a new record, they were further reinforced as valid information, even though in they lacked a solid legal foundation. Throughout Lily's childhood, no event was significant enough to force the involved organizations to review her records from scratch, and no circumstances caused her to question those details herself, as all practical needs were met within the framework of her current identity. This allowed the unusual signs, though clearly present when viewed retrospectively from an investigative perspective, to dissolve into the flow of everyday life, without creating any disruption or conflict large enough to draw attention. In that context, Lily's childhood passed with an outward stability, while beneath it was an inconsistent and incomplete personal information structure, a fragile foundation but sufficient to sustain a normal life for many years. The long-term overlooking of these signs not only reflected the limitations of the administrative systems of that era, but also showed how an identity could be maintained without full verification, as long as no factor forced it to be re-examined. Within the scope of this section, the anomalies regarding documents, date of birth, place of birth, and record gaps existed as faint signals, not yet connected to the disappearance case in Boston and not sufficient to disrupt the continuity of Lily's life in New Hampshire, but they quietly accumulated over time, becoming key details awaiting recognition when context and tools allow. As the anomalies in documents and civil records continued to exist quietly throughout childhood without creating overt conflict, Lily entered adulthood with a life that appeared relatively stable from the outside, built on familiar milestones such as completing high school, entering the workforce, forming social relationships, and gradually becoming independent according to the norms of the community where she lived. On the surface, this life was not significantly different from that of her peers, with steady work, a moderate circle of relationships, and a routine without major upheavals, enough to create the sense that Lily had fully integrated into her surroundings and carried no traces of a fractured past. However, alongside that stability was an indefinable feeling of not fully belonging, a vague state related to personal identity that Lily could not easily put into words, but that persisted in how she viewed herself and her place in relationship. This feeling did not stem from a specific event or newly revealed information but formed gradually over time, as Lily realized that her stories about family, origins and childhood memories often lacked depth or did not connect with what she observed in those around her. Though there was no concrete evidence to confirm that difference, the lack of harmony still existed as a quiet emotional undercurrent, not strong enough to cause an immediate crisis, but sufficient to create an invisible distance between Lily and others when it came to issues of identity and root. During this period, Lily tended to avoid deep engagement with her personal records, not because of specific suspicion, but because confronting administrative documents always came with a vague sense of discomfort, as if that information did not fully reflect the person she was becoming. This avoidance manifested in letting others handle procedures when possible, limiting her own review of old documents, and not proactively delving into administrative details that were considered normal for many others. This avoidance helped maintain the outward stability of Lily's life, as not asking questions meant not disrupting the identity structure established long ago. A structure that, though lacking a solid foundation, was still sufficient to function in everyday life. More importantly, Lily did not raise specific questions about her origins during this phase, as there were no clear facts forcing her to do so, and also because questioning identity could lead to unpredictable consequences she was not ready to face. The feelings of not belonging were explained by Lily in more familiar and safer ways, such as attributing them to personal temperament, differences in living environment, or simply the common feeling many adults experience when seeking their place in society. This interpretation allowed Lily to continue her life without needing to challenge foundational assumptions about herself, while avoiding direct confrontation with the long-existing information gaps that had never been placed under scrutiny. In personal relationships, Lily maintained balance by focusing on the present and near future, rarely sharing deeply about the past or family stories, not out of a desire to hide, but because those stories did not bring her a clear sense of connection or meaning. This further reinforced an outward image of stability, where Lily appeared as an independent, self-sufficient individual, not publicly obsessed with identity issues, even though unanswered questions lingered inside. The absence of specific questioning about origins in adulthood also reflected an adaptive mechanism, as Lily prioritized psychological safety and life continuity over digging into issues that could shake her current foundation. In that context, Lily's identity crisis did not erupt as a clear event, but existed as an undercurrent, influencing how she viewed herself but not yet strong enough to drive action in pursuit of the truth. The outward stability of adult life, combined with avoiding personal records and not raising specific questions about origins, created a fragile balance in which Lily could continue living without confronting the deeper contradictions in her identity. Within the scope of this section, Lily's adulthood is characterized by the coexistence of stability and vagueness, between a smoothly functioning life and an undeciphered sense of not belonging, laying the psychological groundwork for larger changes that might occur when external factors, beyond her control and avoid, begin to intervene in the identity structure maintained for many years. The fragile balance that Lily had maintained throughout her adult years began to break when the person who raised her passed away, an event that carried not only emotional loss but also triggered a series of practical changes, forcing Lily to directly confront parts of her life she had always avoided. Handling funeral arrangements and reorganizing living spaces meant Lily had to review a large volume of personal papers, administrative records, and archived documents that the caregiver had accumulated over many years, items previously outside her sphere of concern, while life ran stably. In this process, the personal documents related to Lily began to reveal inconsistencies far clearer than what she had vaguely sensed before, as when placed side by side in the same context, the differences in information could no longer be simply explained as minor administrative errors. Some papers presented Lily's origins in a way different from what she had been told, while others completely lacked foundational information considered essential for a legal upbringing process, creating a fragmented but contradictory picture of her background. These contradictions were not just in specific details, but in the overall structure of the records, as there was no seamless chain of documents clearly proving how Lily came to the foster family from the initial point to her registration in local civil system. The absence of critical documents such as legal guardianship decisions or formal adoption records forced Lily for the first time to confront the possibility that the story of her origins might be incomplete or inaccurate compared to what she had believed. The death of the caregiver meant there was no longer anyone who could directly explain or clarify these contradictions, and that silence only heightened the unease as Lily realized that the answers she had previously avoided were now inaccessible through the old path. The discovered documents did not provide a complete explanation on their own, but they were enough to raise questions about how Lily had come to the foster family, under what circumstances, and whether some part her past had been overlooked or obscured over the years. The conflicting information about origins was no longer just uncomfortable administrative details, but became signs that the identity structure Lily had relied on might be built on a foundation lacking transparency, even erroneous. In the context of emotions disrupted by loss, discovering these contradictions created new psychological pressure, as Lily had to face not only the pain of losing a loved one, but also instability about herself, an instability she could previously ignore but now could no longer escape. Doubts about her identity began to form not as clear conclusions, but as a series of unanswered questions, revolving around who Lily really was and whether the story she had been told about her past remained reliable. These questions did not appear suddenly, but gradually occupied her mind as Lily tried to piece together scattered information from different documents, realizing there was no unified narrative strong enough to explain all the facts before her. The emergence of identity doubts marked a significant shift in how Lily viewed her life, as for the first time, the vague sense of not belonging that had lingered for years now had a concrete anchor, not just an aimless emotion, but an issue needing clarification. The death of the caregiver, therefore, was not only the end of a life phase, but also the triggering factor, forcing Lily to confront the information gaps she could previously choose to ignore, transforming the accumulated anomalies over time into a central question about identity origin and the connection between an obscured past and the present she was living. From the doubts about her identity that arose after reviewing the personal documents left behind, Lily began entering a phase of directly confronting the civil and administrative record system tied to her life, for the first time proactively re-examining data that she had previously had no reason or motivation to scrutinize comprehensively. This review process did not occur in a single action but extended through multiple steps, as Lily approached different sources of information one by one, from local records and documents archived at administrative agencies to the papers used in educational and employment procedures over many years, with the goal of determining whether there existed a consistent chain of data clearly proving her origin. When the records were placed side by side, the discrepancies that had previously existed in isolation began to reveal themselves more clearly, indicating a pattern of anomalies spanning many years rather than random or isolated errors. The information regarding date of birth, place of birth and time of appearance in the civil system not only differed across documents, but also lacked logical connections, creating gaps that no record could reasonably fill. The discovery of these prolonged discrepancies led Lily to realize that her administrative identity had been maintained based on unverified assumptions, as each agency only processed a portion of the information without responsibility for verifying the entire data chain from the beginning. The deeper Lily delved into the review process, the more she noticed a notable common point. There was no document that clearly and legally confirmed her adoption, no court decision, no record of guardianship transfer according to proper procedure, and no trace indicating that a full legal process had ever existed to legitimize her entry into the adoptive family. The complete absence of legal adoption confirmation could not be simply explained by ordinary administrative oversights, because even in the context of lax management from decades earlier, such procedures would still leave at least some trace in the archival system. The failure to find any foundational legal records forced Lily to confront the possibility that her presence in the adoptive family had never been officially recognized by the authorities, and that the identity she had carried for many years may have been established without going through legal channels. This realization completely changed how Lily viewed the previous discrepancies, as they were no longer minor errors that could be overlooked, but became signs, pointing to a larger story obscured behind incomplete paperwork. When the civil clues could not provide a definitive answer about her origins on their own, Lily began considering other methods to determine the truth, particularly scientific testing methods capable of overcoming the limitations of traditional administrative record. The preparation for scientific testing did not stem from a preconceived conclusion but from the need to seek an objective anchor, where biological data could provide information that human archival systems had failed to preserve. In this phase, Lily focused on gathering all existing documents, reorganizing the information chronologically, and identifying the core contradictions that needed clarification as necessary preparation before shifting to a different verification method. This process was more introspective than publicly active, as Lily had not yet widely shared her doubts with those around her, instead mainly comparing and analyzing the collected data on her own. This caution reflected the seriousness of what was being considered, because questioning one's personal origins not only involved historical truth, but could also upend the entire life structure that Lily had built over many years. Within the scope of this section, the late emerging civil clues served as indirect but increasingly clear evidence that Lily's current identity had not been formed through a legal and transparent process, while also creating the need to use verification tools beyond administrative paperwork, if she wanted to get closer to understanding who she really was. From the fact that civil clues could not provide a full and consistent explanation for her origins, Lily shifted to a more objective approach, conducting genealogical DNA testing as the only remaining means capable of overcoming the limitations of administrative paperwork and human memory. This decision did not come from certainty about the results, but from the need to establish at least one biological anchor that could clarify whether her current identity accurately reflected her genetic origins, in a context where all other data contained unexplained gaps. The genealogical DNA testing was carried out through popular civilian genetic analysis services available at the time, allowing comparison of Lily's DNA sample with large databases of individuals who had voluntarily provided genetic information in order to search for potential relatives based on gene match levels. When the initial results were returned, what stood out was not the absence of any connections, but the appearance of genetic links at a closer degree than expected, indicating that Lily had blood relations with people completely outside her current living environment. These connections did not align with the assumption that Lily originated from the New Hampshire area or nearby states where she grew up, instead pointing to a different geographic direction where she had never lived and had no social or administrative ties in her personal record. The discovery of these unusual genetic connections forced Lily to re-examine all her assumptions about her origins, as the gene match levels far exceeded what could be explained by distant or random relations, suggesting the existence of close blood relatives she had never known. As the results were analyzed in greater depth, a common pattern gradually became clear. Most significant genetic connections led to the same geographic area, specifically Massachusetts, a state completely absent from the life story Lily had known up to that point. Identifying ties to Massachusetts was not just a geographic detail, but a perceptual turning point, as it provided a specific and tangible direction for doubts that had previously existed only abstractly. The genealogical data indicated that Lily was likely related to a family line concentrated in this area, with relationships close enough to rule out random coincidence, while clear enough to raise questions about why these ties had never appeared in any prior administrative records or family stories. In the process of cross-referencing the DNA results with the previously collected civil information, Lily realized that the biggest gap lay not in the genetic data, but in the absence of any bridge between the scientific results and her current administrative identity, a sign that the two information systems had developed completely separately over many decades. This realization highlighted the role of genealogical DNA testing as a tool capable of breaking that separation by providing a biological reference axis that could not be altered by administrative errors or information concealment. Given the seriousness of the obtained results, Lily had to consider how to handle the information cautiously, as identifying genetic ties to Massachusetts was not just a personal matter, but could involve missing persons cases or legal events she was unaware of. After weighing her options, Lily decided to submit the information related to the genealogical DNA test results to the authorities, not to make an accusation or specific request, but to ensure that the data was evaluated in a broader context where it could be cross-checked against records she could not access as an individual. Submitting this information marked a significant shift in Lily's role, from a person quietly seeking the truth about herself to a provider of data capable of triggering interest from investigative agents. Though at that time Lily still did not know whether the DNA results would be persuasive enough to overcome the barriers of a case closed for many years. This process did not happen hastily, but was carried out with thorough preparation, as Lily compiled all the test results, related documents, and notes on previously discovered contradictions to provide the authorities with the most comprehensive picture possible of what she had found. Within the scope of this section, genealogical DNA testing served as a scientific catalyst, not providing a final answer, but sufficient to clarify that Lily's origins did not match the identity she had carried for many years, while establishing a specific connection to Massachusetts, turning scattered doubts into a traceable direction with clear data backing. Submitting the information to the authorities did not end the search, but marked the point where Lily's personal journey began intersecting with the official investigative system, where genetic data could be placed alongside historical and legal records she previously could not access, opening the possibility that questions about her identity, suspended for many years, could finally be examined in the light of both science and investigation. From the moment the genealogical DNA test results and related information were submitted to the authorities, the Boston Police Department became the unit directly receiving this unusual data in the context of managing a decades-long archive of cold cases, including unsolved child disappearances. The receipt of the DNA information was not handled as a routine report, as the accompanying data showed a genetic match level large enough to surpass initial skepticism, forcing the intake department to forward the file to the cold case team for deeper evaluation. The Boston PD cold case team proceeded to review all provided documents, cross-reference the genealogical DNA results with existing databases, and determined that the discovered genetic connections were all directly related to the Massachusetts area, a factor fitting the unit's jurisdiction and sufficient to justify reopening some old cases. Among the missing persons cases considered, the file on Lily Cooper, a 6-year-old girl, who disappeared in Boston in 1966 and was later classified as a cold case, quickly emerged as a candidate with notable similarities in timing, age, and basic contextual factors. Reopening the Lily Cooper case did not happen hastily, but began with the cold case team retrieving all original documents related to the 1966 disappearance, including the initial report, witness statements, investigative notes, and all data collected before the case was closed. The investigators compared this information with the new DNA data, focusing on determining whether there was any reasonable match between the historical file and the recently discovered genetic connections. The comparison process revealed many notable intersections, from the time Lily disappeared to the lack of evidence indicating she had died, along with the complete absence of a continuing identity in the Massachusetts civil system after. The investigators also examined basic biological characteristics recorded in the old file, cross-referencing them with current information provided by Lily, and found a high degree of compatibility sufficient to rule out random coincidence. When these factors were placed together, the likelihood of a match between the Lily Cooper, who disappeared in 1966, and the woman currently living in New Hampshire under a different identity began to be assessed at a high level, surpassing initial suspicion and moving closer to a specific investigative hypothesis. The cold case team conducted internal verification steps to ensure that reopening the case was based on scientific and objective data rather than mere speculation, while also checking whether any other disappearance from the same period might fit the DNA results better. Through this process, the Lily Cooper file continued to be strengthened as the case with the highest degree of fit, as the timing, geography, and genetic factors all converged in a way rare for cold cases, spanning many decades. Determining a high probability of match did not mean reaching a final conclusion, but it was sufficient to activate subsequent investigative procedures within the framework of a reopened case, moving the Lily Cooper file out of passive storage and back onto the list of actively processed cases. In this phase, the cold case team's focus was not on pursuing a perpetrator but on definitively verifying the victim's identity, as confirming that Lily Cooper was alive and existing under a different identity was a prerequisite for any further investigative step. The entire reopening process took place in a context where investigators had to work with outdated documents, incomplete data and historical errors, requiring high caution to avoid repeating past mistakes. However, the emergence of genealogical DNA data provided an unprecedented advantage for the cold case team, as for the first time they had a specific biological link that could directly connect the present to a disappearance frozen for many years. Within the scope of this section, the Boston PD's receipt of the DNA information, the cold case team's reopening of the file, and the determination of a high probability of match with the 1966 disappearance marked a significant turning point. As the Lily Cooper case officially escaped the stasis of cold case status and entered a new investigative phase, based on a foundation of scientific data that the investigative system had not previously possessed. When the match probability between the missing person file of Lily Cooper from 1966 and the woman currently living in New Hampshire was assessed as high, the Boston PD cold case team moved into the phase of fully reconstructing the entire case by combining historical data with modern analytical tools and methods, viewing this as a necessary step to clarify what had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The first focus of this process was cross-referencing the old timeline compiled from 1966 reports with a new timeline built from current data, including genetic information, civil records, and key milestones related to Lily's life after her disappearance. This cross-referencing allowed investigators to replace each event in a broader context, no longer constrained by the assumptions and perceptions of the earlier era, while precisely identifying gaps that the old timeline could not explain but for which the new timeline provided indirect clues. Through this process, many details once considered unimportant or unconnectable in the initial investigation began to reveal their significance, particularly the short but critical intervals between the last sighting of Lily and the moment the family realized she was missing. Gaps that modern data suggested might have been sufficient for a deliberate act to occur. As investigators reanalyzed the 1966 case handling in light of new data, initial investigative errors gradually became clearer, not as individual mistakes, but as consequences of systemic limitations, from underestimating the possibility of a non-violent abduction to lacking tools to connect information across individuals and events. The initial classification of the case, delays in prioritizing resources, and an approach biased toward the runaway hypothesis were all re-examined as factors that inadvertently narrowed the scope of the investigation from the start, causing many potential leads to go unpursued. Alongside identifying errors, the cold case team re-circumscribed historical suspects previously considered, using new criteria based on modern data to reassess each individual's degree of relevance. These suspects were placed in a different analytical framework, where access to Lily, opportunity for movement, geographic connections, and fit with a non-violent abduction scenario were examined in greater detail than before. The re-circumscription was not aimed at immediately identifying the perpetrator but at discarding outdated assumptions and focusing on the most evidence-based possibilities in the context of new data, including the fact that Lily had survived and matured under a different identity for many years. As historical suspects were re-evaluated, some cases previously dismissed due to lack of direct evidence began to be taken more seriously, while others that had consumed significant investigative resources were deprioritized as they no longer fit the reconstructed scenario. This process allowed the cold case team to gradually narrow the hypotheses about how Lily disappeared, shifting from a broad set of possibilities to a few specific scenarios with higher consistency across both historical and modern data. Narrowing the hypotheses did not mean eliminating the case's complexity entirely, but rather creating a clear enough analytical framework to guide subsequent verification steps, especially those related to confirming identity and clarifying the chain of events leading to Lily living under a different identity for decades. Throughout the reconstruction, the cold case team had to continually balance reliance on scientific data with respect for the historical context of the case, as 1966 investigative decisions could not be judged simply by modern standards, but needed to be understood within the conditions and limitations of that era. However, it was precisely this combination of perspectives that allowed a comprehensive picture to emerge, where new data not only supplemented the old file, but also explained why the case had remained unsolved for years. Reconstructing the case with modern data was thus not merely a technical analytical exercise, but a process of fully re-evaluating the investigative logic, from initial assumptions to how clues were handled and discarded. Within this section, the cross-referencing of old and new timeline, identification of initial investigative errors, recircumscription of historical suspects, and narrowing of case hypotheses created a stronger foundation for understanding what happened to Lily Cooper, not by replacing the past, but by placing it within an analytical system where modern data could illuminate points once obscured by the limitations of the time. Building on the analytical foundation strengthened by reconstructing the case with modern data, the next decisive step implemented was direct and irrefutable identity confirmation, aimed at turning the high-probability match hypothesis into an investigative conclusion with legal value. This process began with direct DNA testing between Lily and individuals identified as potential blood relatives in the 1966 Lily Cooper missing person file, a step designed to completely eliminate any possibility of error or random coincidence that might remain in indirect genealogical testing. DNA samples were collected and processed according to modern standard protocols, ensuring accuracy, verifiability, and legal validity of the results, while being cross-checked in a tightly controlled environment to avoid future errors or disputes. When the direct test results were analyzed, the genetic match level exceeded the absolute confirmation threshold, demonstrating an undeniable blood relationship between Lily and the Cooper family in Boston, thereby closing off any remaining doubts that the two identities existing in parallel for decades actually belonged to the same person. Alongside DNA testing, the cold case team cross-referenced medical records and biological characteristics stored from the 1966 disappearance with Lily's current data, including seemingly minor but highly identifying details such as physical features, medical markers noted from childhood, and stable biological factors over time. This cross-referencing revealed significant compatibility, further reinforcing the conclusion that Lily Cooper not only existed genetically, but also matched the biological descriptions recorded before her disappearance, tightly linking the historical file to the present reality. When data from direct DNA and medical records were placed side by side, the investigative team reached internal consensus that Lily Cooper, the girl who disappeared in Boston, was indeed still alive and had matured under a different identity for many years, a breakthrough conclusion not only for the case, but also for all prior assumptions about her fate. Confirming that Lily Cooper was alive marked a pivotal moment in the investigation, as for the first time in decades, the case no longer revolved around whether the victim had died, but shifted to clarifying the manner and circumstances of that prolonged disappearance. After identity was scientifically and biologically confirmed, steps to complete legal verification were implemented to update and adjust Lily's official records in the judicial and administrative systems, ensuring the investigative conclusion was fully reflected in relevant legal documents. This process included linking Lily's current identity to the 1966 Lily Cooper missing person file, recording the confirmation results in the cold case system, and preparing necessary documents to recognize Lily's legal status as a missing victim found alive. Completing legal verification was not just administrative, but a necessary step to protect Lily's rights in subsequent phases, from accessing investigative files to decisions related to identity and family relations. Throughout this process, the cold case team worked carefully to ensure all conclusions were built on solid data, as the case's unique nature demanded a higher degree of certainty than many others to avoid any potential disputes or doubts arising later. When all confirmation steps were completed, the Lily Cooper file was officially updated from an unsolved cold case to a case with a victim confirmed alive, a rare outcome in the history of decades-long missing persons cases. However, within this section, the focus is not on the subsequent consequences of that conclusion, but on the identity confirmation process itself, where science, historical data, and law intersected to deliver a definitive conclusion about the real person behind the two parallel identities. Confirming that Lily Cooper was alive and completing legal verification closed a long chapter of ambiguity and doubt, while laying the groundwork for next steps in case processing, but the conclusion itself was sufficient to mark one of the most important moments in the entire story. When a child who disappeared from Boston in 1966 was finally confirmed to still exist, with her true identity restored after more than 3 decades in obscurity. After Lily Cooper's identity was conclusively confirmed through direct DNA data and related legal procedures were completed, the next highly sensitive and cautious step was contacting Lily's biological family in Boston, who had lived for decades with an unresolved loss. This contact was not carried out abruptly or in isolation, but was carefully prepared internally by the cold case team to ensure information was delivered accurately, completely, and with necessary support to minimize psychological impact on recipients. The investigating agency reviewed the current status of the Cooper family, identifying surviving relatives, direct blood relationships, and their life contexts, as after more than 30 years, family structure had changed significantly. And not all who participated in searching for Lily in 1960. When formal contact was made, Boston PD representatives approached the Cooper family in a private setting, providing information step by step rather than immediate conclusions, allowing time for the family to absorb and process emotion. Identity confirmation results were presented based on scientific and legal data, including DNA testing details, genetic match levels, and verification steps taken, ensuring the family clearly understood the basis of the conclusion without facing new doubts or ambiguities. Result disclosure emphasized data certainty while avoiding speculation or expansion into unresolved aspects, keeping focus on Lily Cooper being alive and found after years missing. During this process, the Cooper family's reactions were multifaceted, as hope buried for years was suddenly revived, accompanied by confusion and disbelief at a reality far beyond what they had imagined for Lily's fate. The cold case team coordinated with psychological experts to support the family during initial information reception, recognizing that learning a relative was alive after decades was not purely joyous news, but also brought complex emotions tied to loss, past time, and irretrievable opportunity. Alongside notifying confirmation results, cautious steps to prepare for reunion began, considering psychological states of both Lily and the Cooper family, as well as legal and practical factors related to meeting after long separation. This preparation included exchanging basic information between parties through investigative agency and support expert intermediaries, establishing initial understanding before any direct meeting. In this phase, initial psychological support was seen as key, not only for the Cooper family but also for Lily, as both sides faced sudden shifts in perceptions of their past and present. Support experts focused on helping parties process emotions, set realistic expectations, and prepare mentally for possible reactions, from joy and confusion to regret or grief over lost time. Notifying the biological family was thus not merely an administrative procedure in the investigation, but a critical transitional phase, where scientific truth was placed in a human context with all accompanying emotional consequences. Within this section, the focus is on how information was conveyed, how the Cooper family received confirmation results, and initial preparation steps for reconnecting relationships interrupted for decades, all under investigative agency oversight and expert support to ensure the process was humane and controlled. From the cautious notification process and initial psychological preparation steps, the reunion between Lily Cooper and her biological family was organized in Boston as a formal event under the strict supervision of authorities, to ensure that the meeting took place in conditions that were safe both legally and emotionally for all parties involved. The choice of Boston was not only geographically significant due to the location where Lily disappeared in 1966, but also served as a symbolic anchor point, where the interrupted past and the present were reconnected in the same space, despite decades of change. The meeting was planned in detail, including timing, location, participants, and the sequence of interactions, with the goal of minimizing as much as possible the emotional shocks that could arise when people separated for so long faced each other directly. Lily entered the meeting as an adult, carrying a confirmed identity but still needing to psychologically adjust to accepting a new role in a family that was biologically related but experientially almost entirely unfamiliar. The Cooper family, on the other side, had to confront the reality that the 6-year-old child who had disappeared had now become an adult with a life, memories, and identity formed in a different environment, no longer matching the image they had held in their minds for many years. In that context, establishing family relationships was not understood simply as recognizing blood ties, but as a process of redefining roles, boundaries, and expectations among people meeting again for the first time after more than 30 years of separation. Psychological experts were present throughout the reunion process to support emotional regulation, helping all parties recognize and accept natural reactions such as joy, confusion, grief, or a sense of loss over irretrievable time, while preventing the imposition of unrealistic expectations on the newly forming relationship. In addition, the presence of legal experts ensured that all interactions occurred within a clear framework, avoiding misunderstandings related to rights, responsibility, and legal issues arising from identity confirmation after a long period, including necessary adjustments to civil records and family-related rights. The meeting was not framed as a single dramatic emotional moment, but as a controlled starting point for a longer process, where relationships were rebuilt, step by step, rather than expecting immediate bonding. After the initial formal meeting, the parties began entering the post-reunion life adjustment phase, a complex process requiring patience and flexibility from everyone, as reintegration involved not only emotions but also practical changes in how Lily and the Cooper family viewed each other's place in daily life. Lily had to consider how to integrate her biological family into her long-established life, while the Cooper family had to learn to accept that their role in Lily's life could not return to the state before 1966, but needed to be reshaped to fit the support. Experts continued to act as mediators in this phase, helping the parties build realistic expectations, establish healthy boundaries, and address complex emotions that might arise when past and present collided. Post-reunion life adjustment also included Lily gradually familiarizing herself with her biological family's history, stories, memories, and relationships that she had never experienced, while the Cooper family had to face the reality that many years had passed without Lily's presence, creating gaps that could not be fully filled. In that context, the reunion was not seen as the end of the journey, but as a transitional phase, where the parties learned to coexist with the new truth, accept unchangeable losses, and seek a form of connection suitable for the present reality. The entire process took place under the ongoing monitoring and support of experts to ensure that the reunion, despite its positive significance, did not become a source of new pressure or trauma for any party. Within this section, the family reunion is portrayed as a deeply humane event, but also one full of caution, where science and law opened the door to truth, while people had to learn on their own how to step through that door to rebuild relationships under conditions entirely different from the past. After the reunion took place, and Lily Cooper's identity was confirmed both scientifically and legally, the focus of the case returned to the decades-long unanswered question of criminal responsibility, forcing investigators to review the entire previous handling process from the new perspective opened by the victim's survival. The Boston PD cold case team proceeded to re-examine the list of old suspects recorded in historical files, including individuals who had once been under suspicion but not fully pursued due to lack of evidence or because initial investigative assumptions no longer applied. This review was not based solely on old notes, but placed the suspects in a new context, where Lily, living under a different identity for many years, became a key factor in reassessing each individual's capability, motive, and opportunity at the time. And investigators cross-referenced geographic locations, social connections, access to children, and behavior after Lily's disappearance for each suspect, to determine if any case better fit the nonviolent abduction scenario established during the case reconstruction. However, as the review delved deeper, an unavoidable reality gradually emerged. Most old suspects had either passed away or no longer had sufficient data for reliable verification, severely limiting the ability to gather new evidence. Alongside reassessing suspects, authorities had to consider prosecutorial feasibility, including determining appropriate charges and whether the actions related to the case still fell within the statute of limitations for criminal responsibility. In the context of more than 30 years having passed, many potential charges faced strict statutes of limitations, especially when there was no evidence of more serious actions being clearly recorded or proven. Facing the statute of limitations was not only a legal barrier but also a heavy psychological factor for both the victim's family and the investigative team, as it raised questions about whether justice could be fully served after so many years. Even in cases where the statute did not completely bar prosecution, the bigger issue remained the lack of sufficient evidence to charge, as most physical evidence had been lost, destroyed, or not properly collected from the start, while witness statements had faded over time or were no longer verifiable. Lily being alive, though immensely positive, did not automatically provide direct evidence about the identity or actions of the person who caused her disappearance, making the pursuit of criminal responsibility continue to face difficulty. Investigators had to acknowledge that, although modern data had helped confirm the victim and reconstruct many aspects of the case, it could not fully compensate for the shortcomings in initial evidence collection. When prosecutorial possibilities were comprehensively evaluated, the conclusion gradually formed that the case no longer met the conditions to proceed with legal steps to charge a specific individual, even though the hypothesis of criminal conduct had been logically strengthened. This assessment was not reached easily, but was the result of multiple internal reviews, balancing the duty to seek justice with insurmountable legal reality. Within this section, the post-reunion investigation reflects the limits of the justice system when facing cases spanning decades, where truth can be illuminated but criminal responsibility cannot be fully established. Reviewing old suspects, assessing prosecutorial feasibility, confronting statutes of limitations, and acknowledging insufficient evidence to charge, placed the Lily Cooper case in a special state, where the victim's story was closed with reunion. But questions about the perpetrator and criminal justice remained an unfillable void within the current legal framework. From the conclusion that pursuing criminal responsibility was no longer feasible despite the victim's identity being confirmed, the Lily Cooper case entered a special phase where the boundary between clarified truth and incomplete justice became clearer than ever. The inability to identify the perpetrator did not stem from lack of effort or giving up by investigators, but was a direct consequence of a chain of objective factors accumulated over time, the most important being the prolonged disconnect between the time of the criminal act and the time the case was reopened. Hypotheses about who took Lily from Boston in 1966, how and with what motive remained at the level of investigative logic but could not cross the threshold needed to become legal conclusions provable in court. Most witnesses who provided information in the early phase of the case had either passed away or were no longer able to recall details reliably after more than 30 years, making their statements, if still in the files, unusable as legally valuable evidence. Even for surviving witnesses, their memories had been eroded by time, influenced by false memories, blending of real and assumed information, or stories retold many times in different social contexts, significantly reducing reliability under modern proof standards. The absence of reliable witnesses meant no direct testimony strong enough to confirm the identity or actions of a specific individual related to Lily's disappearance, leaving all hypotheses at the level of reasonable inference, but unverifiable. Additionally, physical evidence, already scarce from the beginning, now almost non-existent, or if pent, not meeting modern preservation and forensic standards, making its use in proceedings impossible. These limitations highlighted the inherent constraints of criminal investigation, especially in decades-long cases, where truth can be accessed through new science and data, but cannot be proven in the way the legal system requires to establish individual responsibility. Criminal investigation in this instance reached the point where all available tools had been used, but the gap between knowing and proving could not be bridged. Lily being alive and found provided important human closure for the Cooper family, but also highlighted the paradox of the case when the question of the perpetrator remained without an official answer. The case thus could not be fully closed in the legal sense, lacking the key element of identifying and pursuing responsibility for the initial act. This incomplete state was not simply a failure but a reflection of the reality that the justice system has limits that cannot be overcome, especially when time has taken away what is needed to turn truth into evidence. Within this section, the things that cannot be proven are not just the perpetrator's identity but the entire chain of motives, circumstances, and decisions that led to Lily living under a different identity for many years, factors that can be speculated but not established with certainty. The Lily Cooper case thus exists at a rare intersection, where personal truth has been restored to the victim and family, but criminal justice stops at a threshold it cannot cross further, leaving an unfillable void in the legal structure of the case. From the state of being unable to prove the perpetrator and the insurmountable limits of criminal investigation, the Lily Cooper case closed in a special form, where truth and justice did not fully align, but still achieved a deeply meaningful outcome for the victim and family. First, the case was conclusively resolved regarding the victim's identity, as Lily Cooper, the girl who went missing in Boston in 1966, was confirmed alive and restored to her real name, after more than 3 decades living under a different identity. This confirmation not only ended the prolonged ambiguity in the cold case file, but also closed a painful chapter in the Cooper family's history, where the biggest question was no longer where Lily had gone or whether she was alive, but was answered by undeniable scientific data. However, alongside that closure was the reality that the case remained unsolved regarding the perpetrator, as no individual was identified, charged, or held criminally responsible for the act that led to Lily's disappearance. The absence of this conclusion did not diminish the value of what had been clarified, but it emphasized the boundary between uncovering truth and the ability to enforce justice within the current legal framework, especially for cases spanning decades. In that context, the role of DNA technology emerged as the decisive factor that completely altered the case's trajectory, as scientific tools non-existent in 1966 became the key to unlocking doors that traditional investigation could not reach. Genealogical DNA testing and direct genetic matching overcame shortcomings in administrative records, witness memories, and lost physical evidence, allowing the connection of an adult to a missing child from years ago through objective biological data. The impact of DNA technology in this case lay not only in the specific result, but in proving that cases once considered unsolvable could be re-examined in the light of scientific progress if suitable data emerged and was processed systematically. At the same time, the Lily Cooper case also showed that technology, no matter how powerful, cannot fully replace foundational elements of criminal investigation, such as timely evidence collection, scene preservation, and thorough pursuit of leads, as early-stage shortcomings can create gaps that cannot be filled later. The significance of the case for similar cold cases lies in providing a reference model for how investigative agencies can combine historical data with modern technology to resolve at least part of cases seemingly consigned to oblivion. Confirming the victim alive, restoring true identity, and reconnecting family relationships showed that the concept of solving a case does not necessarily mean finding and convicting the perpetrator, but sometimes lies in restoring truth and dignity to those affected. At the same time, the case also raised important questions about how the justice system and society define justice in situations where time has eroded the ability to pursue criminal responsibility, but cannot erase the need for victims and families to know the truth. In the overall picture, the outcome of the Lily Cooper case reflects a complex reality, where scientific progress opens unprecedented opportunities, but also clearly exposes the insurmountable limits of traditional criminal investigation. The case was closed regarding identity, clarified regarding the victim's fate, but remained open regarding the motive and person behind the initial act, a legally incomplete outcome but one of profound human value. For other cold cases, this story serves as a reminder that even if not every question can be answered, continuing to preserve, review, and be ready to reopen files when new tools and data appear can yield results beyond expectation, not only for the justice system but for the people who have waited years to know who they really are and what happened to them. The Lily Cooper story shows something that many families in the United States today easily forget. The feeling that our neighborhood is safe can cause us to overlook small but critical signals. In 1966, Boston operated on community trust, children were free to roam, and adults often reassured themselves when seeing a stranger who looked reasonable. That moment of hesitation created a few-minute window for Lily to leave supervision without causing a scene. The first lesson is treat unusual signals as something requiring immediate action, not something to explain away. In practice, this can mean teaching children simple rules. Never go with a stranger even if they say they know your parents. Always return to a fixed meeting point if separated, and use a family password when someone comes to pick them up. The second lesson comes from the investigation. In this case, delays and scattered data turned it into a cold case. So in emergencies, providing information with a clear timeline, retaining data, photos, descriptions, exact places and times, and reporting to police early is crucial. The third lesson comes from Lily's life in New Hampshire. Discrepancies in paperwork, birth date, birthplace went unnoticed for decades. In America today, everyone should periodically check personal records, birth certificate, social security, medical files, especially if there are unexplained gaps. And finally, the DNA turning point reminds us that technology can restore identity, but it cannot restore time, so proactively prevent, store records, and build safety habits for children starting from the smallest thing. If you find the Lily Cooper story demonstrates the value of not forgetting cold cases and the power of modern technology in restoring identity to victims, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following cases that seem buried by time. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video with another story that still has many unanswered questions.